Democratic presidential hopeful Pete Buttigieg has snagged some key establishment support. 3 former Obama officials, including former aide and special assistant Reggie Love, have thrown their support behind the South Bend mayor. In a statement, Love said in part, "A lot of what is said about Pete echoes critics said about Barack Obama. I believe there's never a better time to fight for change than right now."
Hilarious. These endorsements come just days after Vice President Joe Biden accused Buttigieg of stealing his health care proposal. But will these endorsements actually hurt Joe Biden, or are they going to help him? Joining us now via Skype to weigh in is David Pakman, host of The David Pakman Show and friend of our show. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, so what do you make of these endorsements? Reggie Love, that's a funny one, coming for Pete Buttigieg and how they may affect the race.
Yeah, I think this is super safe for the establishment. So if you step back and understand the establishment, centrists, even a lot of corporate legacy media, they want to deny Bernie Sanders and to a degree Elizabeth Warren the nomination. So you might think by starting to endorse or support someone that seems like an alternative to Joe Biden, you might be splitting the vote. You might actually be hurting the establishment and helping Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. But I don't think that's the case. I think that this is a strategy based around the reality that the more Joe Biden is in public, the worse it is for him. After every debate, his polling drops. So it's very safe for the establishment to say, let's support someone who is an alternative to Joe Biden ideologically. But once you pull someone sort of into the universe of centrism, if they say, you know, I like Buttigieg's ideas, but I find him to be inexperienced or too young or whatever, it's a very natural transition to say, well, I guess I'll go with Biden after all. And you're sort of excluding the universe in which Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders exist. So I think it's actually possibly a good strategy for an establishment that wants to deny Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren the nomination.
And why do you think that they've settled upon this? Basically, in order to keep Buttigieg alive for now, they know he's probably not going to get the nomination. He has absolutely zero support amongst the black vote in South Carolina and in some of the other Super Tuesday states, that they'll eventually be able to coalesce around Biden once that happens?
That's exactly right. I think that is, and interestingly, the first 2 primaries, caucus and primary, Iowa and New Hampshire, you don't necessarily need black support to do well in those. And Pete Buttigieg is doing well there. And once you get people into the mind's general ideology of Buttigieg can at least win some primaries. Again, even if he ultimately fails, once you get to Nevada and certainly in South Carolina, based on the way the polls are looking right now, the argument for saying, well, let's simpler one, if you've been propping up someone like Buttigieg all along. Really interestingly, in the last Democratic debate in November, we plotted polling support at the time. Remember, Buttigieg was not doing as well in the polls at the time. We plotted polling support with speaking time. Buttigieg was the candidate who by far got much more speaking time than his polling at the time would predict.
Right.
And the reason for that is becoming very clear as you see all these endorsements roll in.
But, you know, I think that they have considered the notion that Elizabeth Warren could win. I don't think they even consider the idea that Bernie Sanders could win. I mean, you had Hillary Clinton on with Howard Stern. I'm sure you listened to at least some of the key excerpts as we did, with her talking about how disappointed she was that he didn't endorse her faster, leaving out the fact that, of course, he went out and campaigned for her all over the place. He probably campaigned harder for her than she campaigned for herself, and yet she's still blaming him for the loss. But never in that whole diatribe did she even contemplate the idea that he could be the nominee. Her whole focus was, I just hope he endorses the eventual nominee, which will most definitely not be him once that time comes.
Well, not only that, we've also covered on my program that Elizabeth Warren, although she has said many times she's closest to Bernie ideologically in the Senate, she said nothing during the 2016 primary. So actually, if Hillary Clinton wanted to ask questions about the timing of endorsements back in 2016, she could have said, you know, I think that actually Elizabeth Warren is someone whose motives could be questioned, even though it went in a way that was favorable to Hillary Clinton in the end. So I think the questioning of motives and timing is not necessarily a good path for Hillary Clinton to go down. But you see some people are calling it a Bernie blackout. You see what seems to be the coincidental but maybe actually strategic exclusion of Bernie Sanders from a lot of the discussions around polling, around Buttigieg versus Biden. And at this point, it's impossible to say that it's an accident.
Yeah, he's number 2 in the polls.
For sure. He's literally number 2. It's just crazy. I mean, you literally would think that he didn't exist. We're going to cover it later, but there was a PBS NewsHour special. I think, what was it, 15 minutes?
13 minutes long.
And they didn't mention him whatsoever. I mean, I just think for the person who moved, regardless of whatever they think of him, he moved the Democratic primary, the Overton window, on so many different issues so dramatically in such a short period of time. What do you think that is owed to? Is it that they just can't understand it? Is it strategic? We're trying to dive into that here.
I think it's a combination of all of the above. And the sad part is that this stuff does work. And I've read a few interesting pieces that examine, is polling support following media coverage? Does media coverage react to polling support? I mean, at some point, it's a sort of chicken egg thing. But what's very clear is that the polling support that has diminished for Bernie, at least nationally over the last few weeks, is only being reinforced by the fact that he is being ignored. So I actually think the question of which is causing which is less relevant than the realization that this is happening. Yes. And if you're concerned about someone being left out in perpetuity, then it doesn't really matter figuring out whether the cause or the effect is the decrease in polling. It's a red alert problem that is a type of interference in the primary.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting what you say about Pete, because I hadn't really thought about this before. But let's say he wins Iowa, he's very non-threatening to Joe Biden in particular, because he has so little support in the African American community in particular, or in the Latino community for that matter. He has so little support. He's not going to go much further than doing well in Iowa, maybe doing well in New Hampshire. So it's non-threatening, but it keeps someone like Bernie Sanders. Now, if he were to win both Iowa and New Hampshire, then you got a real ball game on your hands, because not only does he have a base of working class, multiracial working class support, he also is number 2 for Joe Biden supporters and number 2 for a lot of older African Americans who, if they were looking to switch, he would be the logical person to go to.
Yeah, this is what a lot of people maybe are ignoring. Donald Trump has correctly said, okay, I lost to Hillary by 3 million votes, but had it been a popular vote election, I would have run the entire thing differently. Yeah. The same analysis applies to the primary, which is if every state voted on the same day, the way that the establishment would try to deny Bernie or Warren the primary would be a different strategy. In this particular case, if you can deny Bernie or Warren a win in Iowa, a win in New Hampshire, and it goes to Buttigieg, even though it seems like Buttigieg and Biden are more in a direct competition, once you get to the days where many states vote, if Joe Biden remains in the lead and cleans up in a lot of those, you win by having denied Bernie or Warren momentum early on in those early states.
That's very interesting.
Well said.
Hadn't thought about it. Very well said, David. Great to see you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, guys.
Next up on Rising, labor protests continue raging in Paris, France, as citizens show their opposition to proposed pension plan cuts.
Economist Professor Richard Wolff explains what those alterations would be and the latest U.S. economic news when Rising continues.